Hello and welcome to the Handplane Challenge. I'm Mark, your host and referee. It's been a little bit of time since I've done a video, but I'm happy to report that my taxes are now done, so I can finally get back to making videos. Today's Handplane Challenge is going to feature the Buckeye Saw Vice jack plane compared to the Chaplin's original patent smoothing plane. Yes, jack plane versus smoothing plane, it can't be helped. I've only got one of each. I was originally going to compare the Buckeye Saw Vice jack plane to the Stanley Bailey number 5, also a jack plane. However, it really has a lot more in common with the Chaplin's original patent plane, as we'll see a little bit later. So we're going to go with that instead. We've already covered the Chaplin's original patent plane in an earlier video, so we're not going to devote much time to discussing it. Feel free to refer to the earlier video if need be. I want to state for the record that everything I know about the Buckeye Saw Vice company and their planes I got from one reference, which is PTAMPIA, Patented Transitional and Metallic Planes, volumes 1 and 2 by Roger K. Smith. So please consider this an official citation of the reference. The Buckeye Saw Vice company started production of planes and other tools somewhere between 1907 and 1912 in Cleveland, Ohio. Yes, we've finally left the Northeast, so that is something new and different. They apparently continued until about 1929 and then ceased production. One presumes this was due to the Great Depression. They made other woodworking related tools such as joiner gauges a la Stanley 386 and a foot powered saw set. I guess that was a good thing to have back in the early 1900s. These planes are sometimes referred to as Muell's patent planes, after John Muell. That's M-U-E-H-L. I hope I'm pronouncing that somewhat correctly. Almost nothing is known of Muell, and it is believed that he sold the patent to John Gaede, G-A-E-D-E. I also hope I'm pronouncing that somewhere close. The superintendent of the Buckeye Saw Vice company from its inception until it ceased production. That's all we're going to do for the history of the Buckeye Saw Vice company. I would like to say one other interesting little factoid. One thing that I found particularly interesting is that the depth adjustment mechanism on these planes is very similar to a Norris patent. Now these planes this adjustment mechanism was patented in 1904, and the Norris adjustment mechanism wasn't patented until about 10 years later. So it does make one wonder if somebody from the Norris company wasn't visiting Cleveland, Ohio on vacation sometime between 1904 and say the start of the World War I. Anyway, speculation on my part. Lastly, it's worth noting that the Buckeye Saw Vice smoothing plane, not this one, but a smoothing version of this one, sold for about $2.25 in 1912. And if you've been following the video series, you'll know that that's pretty comparable to most of the other planes from that time period. So So not undercutting the competition, about the same. Okay then, so let's see what makes this plane tick. Okay, let's get up close and intimate with the Buckeye Saw Vice jack plane. As you can see, its overall form is very similar to any other jack plane. It's 14 inches long. The cutter is just a hair less than 2 inches wide. We got a corrugated bottom down here. And we got a very unique depth adjustment mechanism there. We're going to go into that in much more detail in a minute. I'm going to go ahead and say it. You'll see it more when we take it apart, but it's got a fixed frog, so no adjusting on this mouth opening. It's got a unique plane iron cutter, so if you use that one up, you're going to be out of luck in this day and age. Probably hard to find a replacement. And that's pretty much what I'm going to do. What I'm going to say before we take it apart. One thing that's of interest in this plane is, originally when they were first produced, it was only available in a smoother and a foreplane. And the original intention was that you adjust these screws here to move the cap iron back and forth to, relative to the end of the blade, so that you could make that foreplane operate as either a jack plane or a foreplane or a joiner plane. So the boast was that you only needed 2 planes, a smoother and a foreplane, in your toolkit, and you could do all the work that you needed to do. Apparently, that was not a very popular notion, as you can see by the actual jack plane in front of you. Apparently, since they expanded into other plane sizes after they started production. Okay, let's take it apart. This is, we're going to go kind of quick here. This plane cutter is supposed to go out through the bottom of the plane. I have not found that to be a workable proposition. So what I've been doing is taking it apart the old-fashioned way. Like that. It barely clears there. So this is the depth adjustment mechanism. So, like I say, it's sort of a Norris style mechanism. So it moves this piece up and down. This has a pin that mates with a hole in the cutter, so you move it up and down, and you can move it side to side for lateral adjustment. So, like I said, very similar to a Norris, depth adjustment and lateral adjustment all in one lever. If we now take apart the plane, you can take this rod out and it can be a little finicky, and we hope we can get it back. Well, I've had it apart and I know I can get it back together. Okay, now what you see is
the rod fits through those custom nuts there, so that when you adjust these screws on the lever cap, you can run the cap up and down as so. I found this not terribly so to my liking. So as you can see, one thing is you have to make sure that these things align evenly so that you're parallel with the bottom of the plane. I found that actually a little bit challenging. So that's basically the idea behind this lever cap. Let's look a little bit more here while we got it apart. This is the casting. You can see that the casting was not very even on the bottom of the plane here. It runs shallower on this side, heavier here. So kind of a flaw there on the casting. As I said, it was explicitly stated that the iron was supposed to be able to move up in and out from the bottom of the plane. However, I have been unable to make that happen. So again, that would appear to be a manufacturing flaw of some sort. Okay, so now let's go ahead and put it back together. Let's put it in. Okay, I think we hit our spot. Gets a little easier with repetition. Okay, so that's that. Cutter goes in. Actually, we need to put the other thing in first. Let's go ahead and put these guys back together. Make it a little snug, not too tight. It does, the tightness of these screws does influence, again, a thing that I don't particularly like. The easiness, the rotation there is dictated by the tightness of the screws. Now we can put our lever cap back in, drive it to the bottom, and hopefully we're somewhere near where we need to be to engage one of those little holes and be somewhere where the cutter can actually do some good. I think you're probably starting to get an idea here that there's some stuff here that is leaves a little bit to be desired. One being, how do we make sure that that thing mates in a hole, in the right hole even. Yeah, I think that's got it. Okay, now we've got it back together. Let's discuss the adjustment procedure relative to that of the Chaplin's patent. Okay, this plane, like the Chaplin's patent plane, is one where the lever cap functions as a chip breaker as well. Now, as you will remember when we were taking it apart, these adjustment screws basically move the lever cap up and down, so none of that has anything to do with the cutter. Basically, you use these screws to adjust the end of the lever cap relative to the sole of the plane. That means that you need to know pretty well where that lever cap needs to be beforehand to get the proper setback of the chip breaker relative to the end of the cutter. And as of this video, as of the time of this video, it's not clear that that's anything other than a trial and error process. Secondly, then, as this adjustment knob moves this captured nut up and down to move the cutter up and down. The lever cap doesn't move. So when you've adjusted these two screws here to put the end of the chip breaker or lever cap at a certain point relative to the bottom of the sole, then you use the depth adjustment lever to move this thing, and if you can see it on the camera, you can see that the cutter moves up and down. The end of the chip breaker stays constant, so that when you're adjusting the depth of cut, your chip breaker clearance, if you will, is constantly changing. Okay, let's contrast that with the Chaplin's original patent plane. Like the Buckeye Saw Vice plane, this plane's lever cap also functions as a chip breaker. So it has a very specific procedure that needs to be followed, but once you know the procedure, it's relatively easy to set this plane. You start with the depth adjustment all the way up to the left here. You adjust, you loosen the knob and adjust the lever cap up and down until you get where you actually leave the lever cap down, and then you move the blade so that it gives just the right amount of chip breaker clearance, and then you tighten it back down. And it may move a little bit when you tighten it, but you can, basically it's a question and not an easy thing to fill with. Then you've established the chip breaker clearance there, and now you can set the depth with the depth adjuster here so that it moves the cutter up and down. Because the frog moves in this plane, and the whole assembly moves up and down, and so the chip breaker clearance is maintained. Frankly, this seems like a much better arrangement than the one on the Buckeye Saw Vice. Okay, so what have we learned here? The Buckeye Saw Vice plane, we saw the casting was somewhat rough a little bit. I couldn't get the cutter to be inserted or removed through the bottom of the plane as specified in the literature. That also seems to be a casting error or inaccuracy. The lever cap mechanism just doesn't seem like that's the right way to do it because of the way it's constantly changing the chip breaker clearance. And the Norris adjuster here, as you can see even now, it's very sensitive to the tightness of these 3 screws, and so it's prone to binding a little bit and not moving back and forth very smoothly. So that's not going to bode well for our conclusion on this plane, but we'll save it until we do a shaving comparison. Alrighty. Okay, let's take some shavings. So here's the Buckeye Saw Vice plane. Right now I have these screws adjusted to give a very narrow distance between the end of the lever cap and the end of the cutter. A fine set, so to speak. That would be joiner mode according to the literature. So now we're okay, there's a light shaving, whole length of the board but a little bit narrow. Let's just move it down just a little bit. So that tiny bit of difference made for a much wider and more continuous shaving. It's fairly much thicker now, and that's probably that could well be due to the fact that I moved the cutter down, the lever cap stayed in position, and so the set got a little bit more coarse. So that would seem to me to be not a very good way of running a railroad. So now that was joiner mode. What I started out with was a fine set. Now we're going to move the lever cap up if we can, which goes, see if we move. Just to illustrate some of the idiosyncrasies of this, here's the lever cap. I had to adjust it because I didn't have it right when I tried to take a shaving. You've got a lot of variables here. This screw threaded into the lever cap, it's variable how far it goes in and out. Then it screws into this captive nut here. And the nut can be at a variable distance by screwing it in and out on this screw. It can be at a variable distance in and out. So all of which takes, at least so far for me, a fair amount of fiddling to get it to be workable. Okay, let's try again. So I had to readjust it. These screws were not in the right place. I've got it set for a fine shaving again. Fine set on the chip breaker. Actually, that was quite an improvement, whatever I did. That is actually almost a decent shaving. And not too thick. It's not bad, actually. Okay, so what it's supposed to be able to do here is switch from joiner mode with a fine set. It should be able to switch from joiner mode to jack mode. By raising the lever cap up. They don't move, you can't move it all the way, of course, you have to move it each side a little bit at a time. Okay, so that was a fair amount of movement on the lever cap. Indeed, now that moved the cutter up at the same time. So now the lever cap stays the same, And yes, we have to now have a very rank set on the chip breaker. Yep. You could almost resaw. Holy smokes. So now, yes, we made a shaving that is thick enough to tie a knot in. Still pretty wide, still pretty much the whole length of the board. But it kind of worked as advertised. We went from jack mode, we went from joiner mode, probably overshot a little bit. That's a really rank set in there, so that's probably why it came out so thick. But that sort of illustrates the extremes. That was the idea. Joiner to four-plane to jack mode. Just by switching these two, you don't have to take the iron in and out. It can be done assembled once you get the screws in the right place to begin with. And there you have it. We'll just do a quickie, so it's not a fair comparison. You know, the Chaplin is the smoother plane, so it's just not going to be any comparison between the two. But to remind people what it could do, need a little more depth. I already had it set with the chip breaker at a fine set. Oops. Oop, went a little too far on that, didn't we? Back. Still too much. Almost as thick as that last shaving. There we go. But you see, so I still don't have it quite right on the depth, but I'm not going to mess around with it too much. I didn't have to fiddle any with the chip breaker setting there. It was just a matter of starting with the chip breaker in the right place and then carefully moving the depth adjustment lever here to give the right cut. So from a fiddling point of view, this one wins hands down. Okay then, let's wrap it up.
So, how do we feel about the Buckeye Saw Vice jack plane? Well, I hate to say it, but my conclusion is that this plane is not quite ready for prime time. In a competition between it and a Chaplin's original patent, I would definitely go with the Chaplin's original patent. This probably explains maybe why Stanley survived the Great Depression and the Buckeye Saw Vice Company did not. Who knows? One interesting sort of narrative that I got from the PTAMPIA book, but completely quoted in there, but in a very matter-of-fact way. Roger K. Smith goes into a bit of the career of John Guida, the superintendent of the Buckeye Saw Vice Company. He apparently bought the patent from Muel, started the Buckeye Saw Vice Company until all the way from its inception till when it closed in 1929. After that, He was listed in Cleveland as a restaurant and gas station owner from 1929 up until about 1935. In 1935, he was listed as a gas station attendant. So, going from sort of owning and running his own business to being the guy that pumps gas. When I first saw this comment, this paragraph in the book, I thought, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Life was tough back in the Depression. Okay, so there you have it. If you like this channel, please subscribe. Even if you don't subscribe, please like it, or better than anything, please leave comments in the comment section. It helps me to know what you like, what you don't like, and what you thought of the video. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.